Well, it's a question about, am I leaning on the pole and keeping it upright, or is the pole leaning on me and keeping me upright? I think it's the latter. Now, I'd like to talk about a serious question today, and that's homelessness. Homelessness. And I'd like to tackle this topic for two reasons. One, I received a letter a few weeks ago, or a lengthy email from a 52-year-old woman who's been homeless for 2 years, who's been through a number of difficult situations, and what we're seeing is a change in the type of people who are now becoming homeless in our society. And secondly, I received an email 48 hours ago from the Victorian Legislative Council, invited me to make a submission to Legislative Council regarding their inquiry into homelessness in Victoria. And it made me focus on the subject, because the thing about it is, when you protest on the steps of Parliament House for public housing, and especially when you do a 24-hour protest or a 10-day protest, is you do notice the homeless. Because when everybody else goes home, the homeless are basically wandering the streets or sleeping. And it's quite extraordinary that it's taken the Victorian Parliament all this time to conduct an inquiry into homelessness, when homeless people are sleeping on the footpath less than 50 metres from Victorian Parliament House every night. And this has been going on for a number of years, and the issue has been becoming more and more heated as more and more people who are just suffering straight financial issues, no drug issues, no psychiatric issues, find themselves now homeless. People who've worked, paid their taxes, reared children, especially middle-aged and older women, who are the increasing, which is becoming the face of homelessness in Victoria and Australia. And we've got to ask ourselves why we find ourselves in this situation. I mean, Melbourne was supposed to be marvellous. Melbourne, for 5 years, the world's most livable city, and last year it was the second most livable city in the world. But the problem of homelessness is becoming more and more acute, despite all these so-called government efforts to deal with the situation. Efforts by governments, privately funded organisations, charities, religious organisations, which get billions of dollars of government money to deal with the problem. And the problem, or the issue, I don't like using the word problem, because the homelessness is not a problem. Homelessness is an issue for society as a whole. Because the homeless are basically the canaries. They're the canaries which are telling us that there are structural issues, institutional issues regarding people being able to access the basic necessities of life. When organisations would dish out food to people who are suffering from hunger, tell you that the need has increased by 25% in the last 12 months. And when organisations which try to provide temporary accommodation for homeless people can't find that accommodation because of the increasing numbers of homeless people, you know you have an issue. And when you see homelessness outside the CBD of a major city, and you see it in regional centres and rural areas, and you see it across the nation, you begin to understand that this is a structural problem. Homelessness is not a personal issue. Most people who are homeless are not homeless because of a drug problem or a psychiatric problem. We're told that ad nauseum, day in and day out, that these people have trouble coping, etc., etc. That's why they're homeless. The brutal fact is they haven't got the money to keep a roof over their head. And what you've got to look at is the institutional structures. Currently, what we're seeing in Australia, and especially in Victoria, which is a Labor state for the last 6 years, what we've seen is a wholesale attempt by state governments, not across Australia, but in Victoria, to move the homeless issue and the issue of housing from the public sector into the private sector. What they are attempting to do is to privatise public housing, initially by privatising the management of public housing, and eventually by transferring the titles of public houses to private organisations who survive under the catchphrase of community housing, affordable housing, and the list goes on and on. Now, these organisations are basically private organisations which are there to make a buck. And what private organisations do in comparison to a publicly run public health system is that private organisations cherry pick who their tenants are. Because at the end of the day, whether they're for-profit or not for-profit, they need to balance the books. And the way you balance the books is by cherry picking who you get in, by changing the rules, by increasing the rent, and the list goes on and on. By having mixed housing where people pay full rent, some people pay partial rent, some people pay 30%, some people pay 35%. So it is an institutional issue because housing in the last 40 years has turned in from a basic necessity to a commodity. Because what we've done is we've opened up the housing market to the private, to the investors. We have legislation in this country, which Australians support when we look at the last federal election, which rewards people for owning more than one home and renting out a home. It gives people a tax advantage. So obviously what we see is investors investing in the housing market, and when you get 50% of houses which are bought or sold by investors, it actually skews prices it pushes prices up, because investors don't make their money from rents, they make their money from capital gain on the investment property they've got. So you've got a housing market which is now controlled by investors, which means that housing prices have gone off the scale. And they've gone off the scale because the public housing sector is no longer a viable part of public housing. Now, I'm very familiar with the situation in Victoria. Only 3% of Victorians now live in public housing. 40 years ago it was over 15%. Less than 65,000 people live in public housing in Victoria, and this public housing has been privatised at a rate of knots by the state government, which has created a number of financial incentives and initiatives which allow that marketplace to be dominated by private organisations. So what happens in a capitalist society when you have no competition? Prices go up. That is the nature of capitalism. We're told that capitalism equals competition. Capitalism doesn't equal competition. The logical consequences of a deregulated capitalist market is the creation of monopolies. When you create monopolies, what they do is they set their own prices because there's no competition. So what we have been saying as I'm the co-convener of Defend and Extend Public Housing and the convener of Public Housing Everybody's Business, we've got one very simple solution to the current homeless problem. A very simple solution. In Victoria, which I'm familiar with, and obviously it's the same in the other states in Australia, state governments access revenue by placing a tax on homes. When you buy a home, you pay stamp duty, which can be quite considerable. On a home of less than $250,000, which you can't find today, it's more than $8,000. Last year, the Victorian state government raised over $6 million in stamp duty. Stamp duty, housing stamp duty, is a tax which is actually raised through the sale of homes. So doesn't it make sense that you would quarantine this money for a strong, viable public housing sector? Because as the public housing sector disappears, competition in the marketplace disappears. It's the same with the deregulation and the sale of the Commonwealth Bank. What we saw, we didn't see a decrease in prices, we saw an increase in prices because the monopolies which control the financial sector were able to set their own prices. And the same happens in a housing market which is dominated by investors, not people who need a roof over their heads. So I know this sounds very boring, but what we need to understand is the nuts and bolts of the way housing is viewed and used in this country today. Because if you don't understand the nuts and bolts, you won't understand how we're manipulated on a daily basis. Now, housing prices have exploded. That means rents have increased, because when investors buy property to rent, they need to pay a mortgage. Most investors are negatively geared. What that means is they've borrowed a lot of money to buy that house, and they've got to pay a lot of money back to the bank on a monthly basis. So rents are elevated. People cannot afford to rent because of poor social security payments. Not only New Start allowance, but this government's attack on vulnerable people by denying them disability support pensions. They crow about the fact that they've actually decreased the number of Australians who now have disability support pensions, although their population increases by over 300,000 to 400,000 per year. So all this increased pressure on individuals means that if they are faced with a crisis, and it could be a marriage breakup, a separation, domestic violence, a child dying, loss of employment, having to go on New Start allowance, means that before you know it, within 3 months, you find yourself homeless. Initially, you rely on your friends and relatives to provide you with temporary accommodation. When they tire of you, you basically find yourself on the streets, and then you're relying on private charities which are funded by government to provide a service, what's described as the homeless industry. Because there are no public housing to put people in, people have to rely on the private sector, whether it's for profit or not for profit, doesn't matter, to house them. So what that means is that once you find yourself homeless, it becomes almost impossible to get a roof over your head. You may have to find a room in some dirty, disgusting little boarding house, $250, $300 a week, which is all your New Start allowance, just to have a roof over your head. But the issue is, what do we do with the $6 billion in Victoria, which is raised from stamp duty on housing sales? Now, if this is quarantine for public housing, you could remove homelessness in 1 month. You don't need a huge building program. What you need is access to housing, and you can do that through spot purchasing, because as the number of public units and houses on the register increase, the number of people who need to rent in the private marketplace decreases. That puts downward prices on rents fall. So as public housing increases and provides real competition to the private sector, private rents decrease. As private rents decrease, investors can't make enough money to pay their mortgage, therefore they will tend to sell. As they sell, prices drop. So people who've not been able to enter the property market in the past can enter the property market at the lower end of the market. At the same time, because people in public housing only pay 25% of their income on housing, you have hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars released into the economy. Because instead of people paying 40, 50, 60% in rent or mortgage repayments, they're only paying 25%. So with the extra money they've got, they buy things. They don't tend to save things, they buy things. They support local businesses. They support goods and services. So you've got and then you've got the positive of kids going to the same school. They're not moving from school to school if they're in rented accommodation. They've got the same network of friends. You create community. And especially if you spot purchase, which means you purchase homes around the state, around Australia, regional Australia, CBD, big cities, outer suburb. The homes are there. It's just a matter of buying them up. And if you, in Victoria, which I'm familiar with once again, if you allocate stamp duty to public housing, you can get rid of homelessness in a month, the waiting list, which is over 85,000 a year, and you can house 1 million Victorians, 15% of the population within a decade, in public housing. And it's a positive result for everybody. Unfortunately, our current government believes the solution to the housing crisis is to increase privatisation of the public housing sector. As you increase privatisation, you decrease competition. You saw it in the banking sector when the Commonwealth was privatised. You saw it in the airports when they were privatised. You saw it with Telstra Telecommunications when Telstra was privatised 20 years ago. And you saw it in electricity and gas. Every sector that's been privatised and there is no competition with the public sector, prices have gone out of orbit. And that's the dilemma we face. So what we are suggesting is, people say to me, oh, those $6 billion, we use it for other things. Of course you use it for other things. You use it for roads. In Victoria we have an orgy of road construction. We have an orgy of people removing railway crossings, building underground railway stations. The Victorian state government made a decision, was elected. It wanted the community to see it doing things. There are votes in people seeing people work take down, railway crossings and build things underground and increase public transport. There are no votes in looking after the homeless unless it becomes such an issue, crime escalates, the response is more law and order. More law and order means more prison, means more crime, more social dislocation, more kids don't get educated, more kids are pushed into drug abuse or alcohol abuse, more social dislocation. And so what we are now doing is we're paying the price of sowing all our seeds as a community in the private sector. Whether it's housing, whether it's finances, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's gas, whether it's oil, whether it's petrol, while the private sector dominates the marketplace, there will be no decreases in prices, because capitalism is about maximising profits irrespective of the human, social, environmental and natural costs. So the homelessness, the people who are homeless, who you see on a daily basis on the streets, in our suburbs, in our cities, across the country, they are the canaries. And there are canaries popping up everywhere telling us there is something wrong with the way the society is structured and the initiatives. Now, you don't need a revolution, you don't need blood in the streets. All you need in Victoria and every other state legislator and in the federal parliament is a majority in both houses of parliament that make housing a priority. Make it a priority, and if that occurs, we can solve this problem today. We don't need to build huge blocks. Spot purchase. If people have issues, offer them a case manager. And obviously there are people who are homeless who have issues who could be assisted by a case manager. So housing first, case manager second, and then move on. Let's give everybody a chance. Give your children and grandchildren a chance. Only 1/3 of Australians actually own their own home outright, and they're mostly elderly. And their children are waiting for them to die so they could actually get a deposit on their own home. So think about it. Homelessness is everybody's business. Go to the Facebook page. Homelessness, everybody's. Go to the Facebook. Public housing, everybody's business. Defend and extend public housing. Public housing is the solution. All it takes is a majority vote in the House of Assembly and a majority vote in the Legislative Council. 88 in Victoria in the House of Assembly, 40 in the Legislative Council, and hey, bingo. That $6 billion could actually be used for public housing. We could resolve many of the issues which we face. We could actually revitalise the economy, decrease crime, and slow down the rate of road construction. Who cares if it takes an extra year to build those railway crossings or build those underground tunnels? Next week, who knows what we're going to talk about. I'd like to thank my friend here for listening. This is the type of supporter you need. Solid, doesn't ask any questions, listens, doesn't complain. Congratulations.